friends, this is Trish and welcome to Teacher Therapy. Today we have a very special guest named Anna. She comes from an extraordinary background of teachers. Her mom has been in education for over 30 years. She's been a teacher for 3 years and she's getting her doctoral degree in organizational leadership and development in education. And she's going to tell us some of her observations, and she's really excited about bringing change to the educational system. So this is going to be a really good talk today. So let's start talking with you, Miss Anna. What initially got you interested in education?
It's kind of funny because my whole life I saw what my mom kind of went through, and I was like, no way, I'm never, ever, ever going into the classroom. But then once I graduated with my bachelor's, I decided to try like being a para-educator. And then I did that for a while and was like, okay, I'm kind of good at this. Maybe I should go for it. So then I got my master's in teaching while I was teaching long-term subs throughout that time. And then I just completed my first year on my residency cert. So that's exciting.
Awesome. Very exciting indeed. So what kind of surprised you the most once you got in the classroom? Were there any shocks or anything that you kind of wasn't expecting it to be that way?
I was surprised at how like little autonomy I had as an educator. I'm very creative. I like to try to make things like interesting and engaging, but it was kind of a struggle against being told like, you got to stick with curriculum. But then ironically, at the end of the year, one of my feedback comments was to try to make the lessons like more personal. Like, so I was confused because I was like, I heard curriculum all year. I was like nervous every time I deviated from the curriculum that someone's going to walk in and say something. Yeah, so that was a bit of a shock as well.
Definitely. So what has being a classroom manager been like for you? Has it been a struggle, or, do you feel like you're strong there? What's that been like?
My classroom management is probably my weakest skill. It makes sense because I've only ever had like 2 full year positions, and one of them I was technically a long-term sub for, and I was still in the midst of like all of my teacher training at the time. But it's frustrating because I try to take like an open, honest, respectful approach. And I feel like that is either seen as like weak by certain like groups of students, or just like they don't respond to that very well. And it hurts me to be like drill sergeant-y, but that's essentially what I had to do to like even get the bare minimum out of the kids. And it was very taxing in that way.
Definitely. So what is your school's classroom management system like? Do they have a specific one in place?
It was essentially like their biggest focus was routines and procedures, which you could kind of develop as your own for each teacher. And I was very consistent with my routines. My kids knew exactly what I was expecting, exactly what I wanted. I would make sure everything was super clear, going over learning targets. When it came time to assessments, we would spend the whole day prior to the assessment going through the rubric and the questions and the vocabulary. And I really wanted them to feel prepared. So I don't think I did poorly in that regard, but it's still just, I don't know if I wasn't clear or if there was just like a disconnect between the students, like what they were receiving and what I was saying. But even though I had those clear procedures, it still was kind of all over the place.
Yeah. So I forgot to ask, what age range do you teach?
Most recently, I've taught a little bit of everything, but just because of the long-term subs, but most recently I taught 6th and 7th grade science. And then some of those science classes were actually taught in Spanish for the dual language program. So I loved the content area. I loved the language aspect. That was awesome. But I just felt like at the end of the day, most of the time I was successful if no one got hurt. And if I got some content in there, great. And if I didn't, at least everyone was safe. But that was very disheartening because it's like, I'm here to teach you guys. I want you guys to grow, but we can't even coexist in a room like with, it is a lot of kids, like 33 kids is a lot, but even my smaller classes, like they struggled to get along with each other or just separate themselves. I'd be like, don't engage. And they just like pick at each other.
Sixth and seventh grade is so hard. So hats off to you. I taught a lot of middle school, mostly sixth grade, but the hardest year ever was seventh and eighth grade. I don't know what happens to them. It's like they become little mutants, but it's so hard. So like, what are some examples of some of the problematic behaviors you would see with your students?
This was also very like frustrating and disappointing, but a lot of like foul language to each other, foul language to me, including like they would call each other slurs because they thought it was funny for some reason. And I would sit there until I was blue in the face and say, like, this is really disrespectful. You have to be careful about what you're saying. You can't just be blatantly disrespectful to people. And no, it just nothing. I'd write them up for it. It still continued. It was just very disheartening because there's just no reason in my mind to be that disrespectful. I can understand being frustrated and like making a poor choice, but it was consistent and it was just, there was no like reasoning behind it at all. So that was very frustrating.
Definitely. So when you write a student up, is it likely that they get a consequence, or how does that work with your school building?
So it depends. How it worked was if there were certain things that were automatic majors and certain things that were minors, but if you wrote the same kid up for the same minor like 3 times, it turned into a major. They would use those to assign like lunch success times and after school success times, which I take everything the kids say with a grain of salt, but I had multiple kids telling me the same thing. It was in their minds and perspectives kind of a joke. The success time, they were like, we hardly do anything. We just like sit there for 30 minutes, do work, and then we just walk around the school. And it's like, oh, okay. So that's wonderful, I guess. And I do think that like my administration tried really hard to like implement consequences, but it's just very difficult to do that without parents getting upset or like all these things just like escalating from it, when it should just be a simple like, this happened, here's the reaction to what you did, and we're moving on. Like, hopefully you learned from it, let's move on. But that's not the case at all. So
what were your parents like in terms of like calling them for their students' behaviors? Were they supportive, or did they fight you? Any parent drama stories?
Not really. Actually, I think it's because I can be very like customer servicey. So I did not have a lot of problems with parents, and I actually had some pretty positive experiences with parents. So I was very appreciative of that. The biggest struggle I would ever have was like contacting multiple times home on a repeated issue and just getting no response. Which like, I mean, I have 17 nieces and nephews. I know how hard it is to have kids and like, you know, take care of multiple kids at once, especially if they're in different grade levels. But it just was a little frustrating because it's like, I want some insight. I want to know what to do to help your kid. And I'm getting zero back. Like,
definitely a common experience. It's kind of funny because it feels like there's 2 extremes in teacher world when it comes to dealing with parents. It either feels sometimes like there's helicopter parents that are looking to like rip apart the teacher, or there's kind of like missing in action parents that you can't find them. And every once in a while you might get unicorn parents that are just amazing. But it sounds good that you didn't have too many crazy parents. So that's always a positive. So I'm kind of curious, how are the kids in terms of getting their work done and, you know, being studious and paying attention? Because a lot of teachers' big complaints now are because of like standards-based grading and some of the new like eternal rolling deadlines. It's so hard to get kids to work. So what was your experience like with that?
That was the hardest part of the academics, was just getting them to do anything. I really dislike the question, is this graded? I would always say it's required if that's what you're asking, because I was not going to say no, because then they wouldn't do it. And then I had a class that had a lot of athletes in it, and I was like, well, it's like playing a sport. You don't just go to the game and play the game. You have to go to practices and run drills and do all this stuff before you can actually play. The assessment's like the game, the lessons are like the practice. And it just didn't click. They just wanted to do what they had to do, the bare minimum of it. I also laid out my rubrics to be extremely clear, and I always provided them with the rubric right at the top of the assessment so they could see exactly what they need to do to get the score they want. We also would review it the day before. So it was also very frustrating because they would kind of just slap something down and be like, is this a 4? Is this a 3? And it's like, well, first of all, the rubric's right there. Second of all, we've gone over the rubric before this. And third of all, is this your best work? Because at the end of the day, I am a firm believer that like the number or the letter doesn't particularly matter as long as it's their best work. But I felt like it was hardly ever their best work. Like they just kind of threw out the bare minimum and was like, well, that'll get me to pass. And it's like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to get you guys motivated to like actually want to engage, I guess. Yeah,
definitely. So what was it like in terms of like meetings and, you know, data collection and just kind of the teacher busy work? Did you have a lot of that or how did that work?
It wasn't too terrible. We did have like certain PLCs for either grade level or content area. And then because I was working for the dual language program, I technically had like 2 content area to go to. I had dual and then I had science. But they were only once a week. They were pretty useful and informative, so I didn't feel like that was overwhelming. This kind of just came with the job description, but there were a lot of like separate dual events. I would say that took up most of my time, but it was actually something I was passionate about, so it didn't feel like busy work. It just felt like another opportunity in that regard. So
well, that's good. That's always good to like have that passion, especially new teacher passion. Have you felt at all like your like teacher dreams have gotten crushed by the reality of teaching, or are you still feeling kind of fired up and passionate?
I feel both kind of. There was a point halfway through this school year where I was like, this might like I don't know if I should be a teacher. Like I don't know if this is the career for me. It just there was a point where it just seemed so impossible, honestly, and I felt like I was pushing and pushing and pushing to get somewhere and then just hitting a wall every time. So that was very frustrating, but I think once I like kind of buckled down and was like, okay, I know I want to teach. I do want to teach. There's just things in the way that are preventing me from providing the best classroom experience possible. What can I do about that? And that's kind of where I've been writing in that document. It's all just based off of pure observation. Like it's not a very sophisticated like document, but just every time I see something that theoretically at least could be simply resolved, I write it down because, I mean, not to say that everything that's good in theory is good in practice, which is kind of like standards-based grading. It's good in theory, but in practice, it's awful, like, just to be frank. But at least it's like something, like a record of ideas or possible solutions. Because I feel like we kind of get stuck in this, oh, it's not going to change. I'm stuck here. I can't do this. I can't do that. When at least you can try to speak up about certain things and hopefully the right ears hear it. And yeah.
Well, I have your document here. I love it so much. Ladies and gentlemen that are watching, she's already getting her dissertation together as a new student. I love it. And some of the things that you talk about that you want to see change in are academic expectations, things like Common Core state standards, curriculum and implementation. So can you just kind of tell us some of your observations about some of those things?
Yeah. So in general, there's like a whole like interconnecting set of issues that kind of twine with each other. But in terms of academics, I feel like there was just a lot of failure of communication on the school system's part, like especially when we switched over to Common Core, because while certain standards could be beefed up a little bit, overall the standards are essentially the same as what we were learning. We're just learning them in new methods, but where we failed as a system for our parents and our students was that we gave parents virtually zero information about the changes that were coming from Common Core. So now they're frustrated. They're less likely to be involved in their students' lives because they don't understand what the student is doing at school. The student's frustrated because they're trying to get help from their parents who are clueless as to why they have to do it in this specific way. So that was one major thing. And then I definitely went in on standards-based grading. It's funny because personally, I have a very lenient retake policy. If a student approaches me and they genuinely want to try to do better, I rarely ever say no to a retake because they're showing me that they're willing to put in the effort to improve. First trimester, it was like 2 days before grades were due, and I had over 30 students failing simply because they hadn't turned stuff in. And then they all just like turned it in the day before grades were due, and that was a nightmare. So just like those little things, like they kind of add up, like they're demotivated because nothing's graded, but when it does come to graded stuff, they have infinite retakes, infinite deadlines. So there's no like healthy pressure on them to, you know, like complete their responsibilities essentially. So I kind of discussed that as well, especially the deadline aspect, because that's the one that bothers me the most, is just the infinite rolling deadlines. At some point, I should be able to say this was months ago, I'm no longer accepting this. So yeah.
I'm curious, how did the other teachers feel about the standards-based grading? And does anybody speak up, or do you feel like people are a little reluctant to say anything?
There were kind of two camps. There was kind of like super duper pro standards-based grading, like borderline brainwashed, like this is perfect. This is our silver bullet that's gonna fix the entire school system. And it's like, there's never a silver bullet. Like that's just the case. And then there were people who were like not happy with it, but also felt like they couldn't say anything. And then at one point our district was discussing, because right now it's like less than 50% is a 1, 50% is a 2, which equates to like a C. I don't know what the other two upper echelons are of like percentage wise, but 50% is at least a 2, which used to be failing and now it's a C. And they were discussing even further of changing a 4 from exceed standards to meet standards. And their rationale was, well, if you're teaching more than the standard, then it's not standards based and it's not fair to grade students on things that are exceeding the standard. So they basically wanted a 4, an A to be what a B is now. And I was not having that. I was very vocal, probably scared a few people because usually first year teachers don't just like say something, but I basically said that's ridiculous for 2 reasons. Our kids that consistently meet standards then don't have anything to aspire to push themselves to grow more. And our kids that exceed standards consistently they're just going to do the bare minimum and call it good when it's not their best work. And we should be inspiring those kids that consistently exceed the standards to keep pushing themselves to grow, despite whether or not that's going to get them a 4 or a 3. It shouldn't matter as long as it's their best work. And I already had kids be like, well, I did what I needed for a 4. And I was like, I know you can do more. And they're like, well, I got a 4, so I'm done. And it's like, oh, geez, okay. What are we doing here?
So I don't know if I understand that. So is it that what used to be an A, you can get that with a B amount of work? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Essentially, that's what they were proposing. And then, so they were essentially proposing shifting the entire grade scale down. So like a 4 now would be what is considered a 3 now, and a 3 now would be what's considered like a 2 now, and a 2 would be, and it was just like, it just made no sense to me, honestly, for those reasons, because it's like they always tell us rigorous academic expectations, make sure you have academic rigor in your classroom. But then when that's not being supported by the grading system, there's only so much I can do to try to get kids to do more than the bare minimum, especially if it's easy to get that 4. So I didn't understand it either. I was very frustrated by it. I spoke up about it. But I don't know how that's going to go. We'll have to see what happens with that.
That's crazy. So does your school have a policy where you can't give zeros, or is it more of the thing like you were saying that because they can turn everything in the last minute, effectively it's kind of hard to get zeros?
Kids would pretty much have to turn in like little to no assignments, or they would have to like, one thing that I was appreciative of is they were really big on no retakes for plagiarism. My personal policy is the first time I catch it, I'll let you redo it. If I catch it again, you already know what the expectations are, so therefore no. But yeah, unless they plagiarized or they literally turned nothing in by grading day. Grading day was essentially the deadline. It's like grades are due today. That's when kids can turn stuff in, which is nuts. I did like propose, and I probably shouldn't admit this, but I did like kind of put into place my own deadlines where it's like, I'm not accepting work after this point so that I have time to grade your work. But then I would also give them time in class to work on missing work, and I would send progress reports home every week that showed them like what assignments were missing. So at a certain point I was like, I'm doing a lot for you guys to get this done. If you can't get it done by this date, that's it. Sorry.
So did you ever feel like your school pressured you to kind of like fudge grades or inflate the grades? Or do you think that since the system is already what it is, it's like the inflated grades are kind of built into the system already?
I think that it is the latter, that the inflated grades are kind of built in already, because now it's always my goal to have 0 to minimal students failing anyway, like just as an educator. But the ones that didn't turn anything in, I only had a handful of kids like literally not turn anything in, which is essentially the only way you can fail. Or you can fail by like consistently not meeting standards, but even like 50% like meeting the standard halfway is a C. So that's still passing. And yeah, so that was just like, I didn't like that. I didn't like that at all. It felt like I wasn't giving them proper feedback. It felt like it's stunting them because, again, it's like setting this limit that they don't have to try to exceed. And they're never going to be motivated to exceed it if they can just do the bare minimum and pass. So
that's so true. Did you feel like you saw the impact in terms of their actual learning with this whole crazy system? Did it make it harder for things to retain and for them to be able to apply the concepts in class and in their work?
I think it did, because they kind of wouldn't take anything seriously unless it was graded. But then all the graded work had to do with the stuff we were working on in class. And especially with like the science curriculum I had, they had like online simulators for different units, and they had bunches of articles that they could access. And so I would tell them, I was like, you can use these as evidence for your like claim evidence reasoning writing or whatever. And they would copy paste a quote and then just be like, this shows this, or like, I think this because this, copy paste a quote, this shows this. In conclusion, and like that was, I had a few kids that wrote like narrative, that like essays, pages on pages, but they were like my 3 or 4 kids that were just like intense. And then all the other kids were like, oh, I can type 4 sentences and copy paste a quote, and that's a 3. That's all I'm gonna do. And it's like, oh. So
yeah, I really had a similar experience because we had a really weird system where nothing was technically graded except for tests, like benchmarks. And so homework, classwork, just like literally everything we did, there was no grade. And so it made it really impossible to get anything done. And so really technically, we didn't even have the system where we could say, okay, you're about to fail because you haven't done anything all semester, because their kind of reasoning that they would give us in the district was that pretty much if the kids can pass the like district benchmarks, almost like who cares if they did any of the steps leading up to it. But the weird thing is sometimes we would re-give the same test so kids can easily sort of figure out how to do it. And there's just like all of these loopholes. So yeah, standards based, I think, is just a total nightmare.
Yeah, and we had a similar thing for us too. Like it was all summative based. So I could give formative work and I could put it in the grade book, but it didn't affect their grade at all. Like it just counted for 0% of their grade. And then the summative works were like the chapter and unit questions, which I always did do in written form, like at least a paragraph of response or something, to avoid kind of like that issue of if they want to retake it, they're going to actually have to write something different this time. So that's kind of how I like weaseled my way around that. But no, there were other content areas where they were having that same issue. Especially with like multiple choice questions. They would just memorize the multiple choice and then they'd go from like 20% to 100% because they just memorized the correct answers. And it's like, that's not what's best. That's my main thing, is like, we're not doing what's best for our kids. And it's not like necessarily at the fault of the teachers, even. It's what we're being told to do that is not what's best for our kids. And it's just something that I can't personally like stand for. It's very frustrating for me because it's like we got to at least give them the best we got, and we're not doing that right now with how the system's set up. So
totally agree. And I hope that there's changes. I just think this is my personal theory about why it's happening. I'm thinking that a lot of districts really want to have good numbers for graduation and for passing rates. And so I think somebody in a dark room somewhere sat around and said, how can we make this happen? And, I actually had an interview of somebody that, their district was one of the main ones that got this whole kind of scandalous system started. And, he basically confirmed the fact that it was completely untested. It was something that not even all of the teachers in the school were implementing. They had no idea what they were doing, but they basically pushed it out across the nation. And now it seems to be like the gold standard in education. And it's just so crazy to me. So crazy.
No, absolutely. I 100% agree with that. And then now that it's been around for a little bit, there's like 1 to 2 studies or whatever, like things that are saying, oh, it does this, oh, it does that. But the thing that frustrates me the most, and I will say this until I'm blue in the face, is that there are decades upon decades upon decades of studies about class sizes and how it affects quality of education. But districts seem to be so quick to jump to this one single brand new flashy study and ignore the fact that our ginormous class sizes are not helping anybody, educators or students alike, even though there's so much, just so like a mind-boggling amount of research supporting that smaller class sizes is what's best for kids. But then you go and you've got classes of 45, 32, 37, and it's like, how that makes no sense to me, how we're so willing to jump on this thing because it's new and trendy, but we're not willing to look at decades of research supporting one specific change that theoretically could be easily made. I'm sure in practice it's a little more difficult, but like it's a simple solution realistically. So
I totally agree. And it's almost funny because if we had to create a recipe of how to guarantee that students would fail, it's everything that's happening now. It's the standards-based grading. It's the taking away consequences. It's the passing everybody along. It's all of these weird practices where everything is about how a student feels and nothing is about objective right and wrong. Like, it's just bananas. And I just can't imagine what it's going to look like in the next 10 years. But I am glad that people like you are fighting for change in the system and that you're working on your doctoral degree. What are some things that you're hoping that you could bring change to? Like, if you had a magic wand and you could change anything in education, what would you change?
I would change community involvement, because even when I was a kid, I felt like the school was like really in tune with the community, and there were all these like community-based events that were run at the school and through the school, and like the communities would donate to schools, whether it be supplies or like anything. People knew what was going on with like school events and fundraisers. And now I just feel like, and I feel like it's both ways. I feel like the communities have kind of given up on the schools, which frankly, I don't blame them with how it's going right now. And then I feel like the schools kind of have isolated out, like they've kind of put themselves on a pedestal in comparison to their communities, which is not at all beneficial for the children in any sense. So I would say like just kind of having that two-way communication between the community and the schools, having that interaction, and then that would also extend to families, because they would have community resources and school resources, and then they would feel more supported and also more willing to support educators and their students, like as they're growing in the classroom. So
that's actually an excellent point. And it's so true. I think that a lot of parents have felt so helpless in the past decade because the changes in education are so like rapid and they're so dramatic. And I feel like the teacher world can have such like high and lofty jargon that it really intimidates people. And even teachers, what we have as common sense knowledge is all being, kind of disparaged and saying, you don't know what you're talking about. These are the experts. These are the studies. These are the research. So even the people that have dedicated their education and life, to helping students are feeling like they're on the outside of the system and what's happening. So yeah, I totally agree. the community, and even having like teachers' voices be a part of what's happening would be so important. And I think I totally agree too with what you said earlier with the kind of two groups of teachers. It almost does feel like, you know, a lot like the people that are dissidents are kind of getting squeezed out. And I've like talked to a lot of teachers that couldn't go on record basically, but you know, they've kind of given experiences of actively being pushed out because they were vocal about what's going on. And I actually know a teacher right now that, you know, they put them on administrative leave without any explanation. And it's just like super kind of scandalous what's happening in education, because it feels like nobody, whoever's making the decisions, it feels like they're not listening to anybody but their own echo chambers.
Absolutely. And especially when it comes down to legislation, I think, I can't remember who said this to me, but it was someone who was higher up in the district. They like came for a meeting and they said that many legislators that are putting through these laws for education and putting through these legal requirements haven't been in a classroom themselves since they graduated high school. And that could be decades ago at this point. So it's like they have no idea what's going on in the classroom, but yet they're kind of the ones that are telling us what to do. And it's like, well, okay, again, a lot of these things sound good in theory. They sound good on paper, but is it realistic? Is it useful? Is it helpful? No. So yeah, I do think that teachers' voices do need to be amplified. And it is also very frustrating that like teachers get pushed out for speaking up. That is actually, I've been given advice like, don't speak up, be careful who you talk to, like just because you never know what's going to happen. But for me at this point, it's like, if I see something, I'm going to say something. And if that costs me my job, then I'll find something else, because it's ridiculous. And nothing's going to happen if no one says anything. So
I love that. I love that. Yeah, that's kind of always my husband's philosophy too, because I'm kind of like a fearful person by nature. I know a lot of people think of me as bold and brave, but I would just be like, oh, I'm so scared to say anything. And he's like, you've got to speak up. You've got to fight the system. Talk to the superintendent. I'm like, no, I don't want to. And I ultimately just ended up kind of like walking away. But I do advocate for anybody that, you know, that can stay in the system to affect change to do so. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and I think your channel is just such a great resource. I know, like, when I found it, I started, like, binge listening to all your interviews, and I was like, oh, that's exactly how I feel. I'm not crazy, because there were so many times this past school year where I was like, am I insane? Am I losing touch with reality? What is going on? I feel like I'm in a Twilight Zone, alternate dimension. This is absolutely insane. And so just hearing like your experiences and other people's experiences and even other perspectives, like when you had the administrator on, that was really eye-opening, because it's like, okay, like I can see where you're coming from on a lot of these things, even if I like kind of disagreed with it or disagreed with what I thought was going on, but it's different behind like the office doors of what's actually happening. So I think that was an excellent choice, and I really appreciate your content. So
oh, thank you so much. You're so sweet. So can you tell me, did you find a lot of support with other teachers and just people in education, or did you kind of feel like you had to keep your thoughts to yourself?
I was very fortunate that one of the content teams I was working for were very close knit. We were kind of still building the program from the ground up, because at this point dual language was only going through 7th grade. K or preschool at the elementary school through 5, and then 6 and 7 was as far as we got this past school year. So the next year there'll be more cohorts, and the next cohort will move up to be the 8th grade class. So we were kind of like in it for the long haul. Like we had to make sure that we were buckled down. We were ready to like kind of do the impossible, but make it possible. So I was very fortunate to have them. Also, one of them, the lead teacher, was like super experienced, super awesome, had a great relationship with the kids, because she was the solo dual language teacher the year before. She was the dual. No, I guess there were two, but one of them had to go on leave at some point. So, but for most of the year, it was just her. So she knew the kids really well. She knew how to make the program successful. She was very like helpful in like coming to observe during her planning period and then giving us advice, myself and the other newer dual teacher. And it was just, I was very fortunate to have that team, but it kind of felt like we were on a little island because of that. I got along with like everybody, but I feel like that's just kind of my personality, is like that I just kind of get along with everybody. But I wouldn't say that I had outside of that bubble, there were maybe only like 2 or 3 other teachers, which we had like over 40 teachers on staff, I think. Maybe not quite that many, but we had a couple dozen at least. They were like, I had my group of like 4 people I could go to, and everyone else I was like either intimidated by, or I just wasn't sure like what I was allowed to say and not say. So yeah, that was an interesting experience.
Well, that's really good. And I think that can sometimes make all the difference in the world, is feeling like you have a support system and that you have at least a few teachers that impact your day, that can help you out and support you, and, just kind of feed ideas off of, because I think one of the other, terrible experiences in education that I don't even think I've made a video about is what happens when you have your own like kind of teammates that you're at odds and don't like each other and are fighting. I'll have to make a video about that one time, but I'm so glad that you had like a really good group of teachers surrounding you. So I'm kind of curious, what advice would you give to somebody that was kind of in the same place, or is in the same place that you were in the middle of this year, where you just felt like you were kind of like hitting your head against the wall and you're like, I don't know if I'm cut out to do this? Like, what would you give them to kind of help them to push through?
I would, this might not be good advice, but I would say, like, if you can make it through the end of the year, at least you have that experience to learn from. And by the end of the year, especially if you're like in this mid-year crisis, you'll have it figured out, whether you don't want to teach anymore or whether you're willing to like still continue to pursue this career. Even if it's difficult, even if it's like very emotionally, mentally, physically taxing, just making it through that year, just because you've already worked hard thus far, so you might as well just finish it off. B, because there's a deadline, like, okay, if I don't like this, I don't have to teach after the last day of school. I can find something else. Or if you do like it, again, there's a deadline for the rough patch, and then you can find either another opportunity or try again with the same opportunity and make some adjustments for the following year. So that's what I'd say. Just like push through, and by the end, you'll have it figured out.
That's really good advice. And I'm kind of curious, what kind of things did you do for self-care when you were just feeling like overwhelmed and stressed out and frustrated? What did you do to kind of help yourself get through those patches?
Honestly, and this was something that I didn't start writing until like towards the end of the year, but it was just that writing, because I was just so upset, felt unheard, felt like almost like, honestly, there were several times where I would go to people and like supervisors, teachers, and say, I feel like I'm struggling with this. What advice can you give me? And they'd be like, no, you're doing great. The kids love you. And I'm like, I love the kids too, but it doesn't matter if I'm not teaching them anything. Like, I'm glad that I can have a good relationship with the kids, but I feel like everyone was just like, I wasn't getting substantive feedback. And I was like, I feel like my classroom's in total chaos all the time, and people keep telling me it's fine. So that was, oh man, that was super frustrating. But other than that, like, I just kind of took that frustration and was like, I'm going to write down all the issues I see and come up with potential solutions. So at least in my mind, I'm solving a problem, even if it's just on paper. And that's what kind of got me through it.
That is awesome. So I'm kind of curious, and I know it's kind of early to ask, but where do you see yourself in like 10 years? What would you like to be doing if, you had a magic wand again and you could do anything within education?
I would want to, there's either 2 directions I'd want to go. I'd either want to be like an instructional coach. I do find instructional coaches useful, but more so instead of in a content area or like a grade level area, or like just good quality practices and strategies, just generally, for any grade level, anything, just like, here's some good substantive like strategies that we know will work. Here's what you can do if this doesn't work. Or eventually probably like upper level administration, just thinking about like the changes I want to make. In order to do that, I'm going to have to find myself in a role where I can actually affect those changes. And that sounds like upper level administration, as much as that kind of scares me, honestly.
Yeah, that is really awesome. And who knows, maybe you'll write the next best-selling book about how to fix education. And I think I'm so glad that you just shared your experiences, because I think being a new teacher in this climate is so hard. Because on the one hand, I think teachers that have taught for 25 years, they could say, when I was a teacher in 1993, this is what we did. But for us younger teachers, all we really have is the memory of our own like middle school and high school experience. So, it can feel really intimidating to say there's something not right about what's happening. So I just really value your voice, and I'm so excited that you're, doing all of this, education in terms of your doctoral degree and your plans for the future. And I think that's going to be so good. So do you want to leave any words of wisdom with anybody that's in their first through fifth year of teaching? Just anything that you'd want to share with them?
I would say don't be afraid to speak up. Like I said earlier, if they find a reason to get rid of you because you saw something wrong and you spoke up, that is their issue. It's probably not a good place for you anyway, but nothing's going to happen if you don't speak up. Like, we need more voices. We need more people that are unafraid. And I'm not going to say that I'm unafraid. It's like a huge moment of stage fright every single time I'm going to speak up against something, because it's not like, I know it could or could not be received well, and it might not be received well. So I would say it only gets easier the more you do it. And it's very crucial that people who are in the front lines of the classroom actually experiencing the effects of all these strategies and kind of systems that we're putting in place, they need to be the ones speaking up. So
beautiful. Yay. Well, thank you so much. And for my audience, if you have any questions for Anna, you can feel free to type them in the comment section, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye for now, everybody.